Hello, my name is Tew, and it's my absolute pleasure to be able to present my presentation in front of the summer school folks. My paper is titled Visions of Rapture in Progress, Socio-economic Entanglements in Tribal Indigenous Christianity of Northeast India. My paper has sought to explore the connections and the interplay between Christianity among Rongmei Baptists and the socio-economic visions that are entangled with their religious teachings and practices. My interest in this topic stems from my own theological observation that Christian teachings and Christian practices among tribal indigenous Rongmei communities tended to advocate disruptions to indigenous life worlds. With their religious histories largely influenced by the activities and the teachings of American Baptists, the socio-economic aspirations of Rongmei Baptists could be summed up, albeit simplistically, in the title of my paper, which is Visions of Rapture and Progress. In a sense, I'm trying to show that the theological visions of salvation, of redemptive histories, and eschatologies, or the theologies of the end, I'm trying to show that these theological visions are reflected in the materialistic, the economic, and even political visions of development and advancement among Rongmei Baptists. Christianity is referred to as Ratsup, or the divine way of life, and I will get to these vernacular concepts later. But I'm suggesting in this paper that this divine way of life provided opportunities for converts to re-envision their futures in the face of drastic transitions that they were going through in the time of their conversion and which is ongoing to this day. At the same time, I argue that the inherent coloniality of imported visions of socioeconomic visions and socioeconomic practices that are warranted by these so-called theologies of disruption have been destructive to indigenous life world. And in contrast, I suggest that theologies of indigeneity and of land could offer imaginative possibilities and alternative ways, life ways that challenges these practices of disruption. By and large, the presentation repeats the main arguments of the paper, but it is slightly differently structured and organized along a slightly different thematic structure. Firstly, it provides context to my wider research and academic interest, and this section includes a bit of comment on my research inquiries and methodologies. The second part is more dense, in which I locate the socio-economic entanglements in the context of the community that I'm looking at, and I emphasize two factors that I argue animate these entanglements, and the two factors are the experience of impoverishments and the notion of heritageization. And in the last section, I discuss the constructive theological discussions that I want to emphasize, which are ethnographic in origin. And I want to suggest through this paper, through this presentation, that mobility of religious and economic visions must be marked by reciprocity and not coloniality. This paper is part of a chapter from my PhD thesis, in which I'm currently in the writing stage, post fieldwork. And my PhD research began with the title Jesu Christa, or Jesus Christ and the Social Imagination in Rongmei Christianity, but it has been since modified to read Jesu Christa in the Land of the Rongmei Nagas. So rather than social imagination, I have found myself preferring the concept of life worlds to describe the thing that I'm trying to interrogate, which is an all-encompassing concept that is interwoven with narratives, with practices or praxis, with cosmologies, with norms and rules, with community and imageries. So life worlds I'm using in my study as a term to describe this concept. My PhD research interrogates how the Christian life worlds, or the vernacular Ratsup, as I mentioned earlier. My PhD research interrogates how Christian life worlds are affected by, first of all, by the pre-Christian life worlds, indigenous life worlds, which is marked distinctly by their indigeneity to the land, closeness and intimacy to the land. In other words, intimacy and relational cosmologies, eco-consciousness, sense of materiality, and immediacy. And in comparison, I argue that the Christian life worlds are characterized by disruption, breakage, or alienation from the land. So, in brief, my thesis broadly explores these arguments. The argument of disruption, that Ratsup or Christian life worlds is markedly discontinuous from pre-Christian life worlds, in the sense that while pre-Christian life worlds have their locus on the land and in the past through narratives and folklore, Christian life worlds, on the other hand, is fundamentally orientated towards heaven and towards the future, the eschatological future, or heaven. At the same time, I also argue in my thesis that there is continuity despite the discontinuity that I have just discussed earlier. And the continuity has to do with the notion of Ratsup as Christian life worlds. And Christian life worlds retain continuities to pre-Christian practices and pre-Christian narratives. And this is a phenomenon that I'm afraid I don't have time to explore further here, but this is a phenomenon that others have called indigenization, and some others have called as translation. And it is in the context of this wider research of discussion of continuities and discontinuities, disruptions and translations or indigenizations. It is in this wider discussion of my thesis that my paper fits in. I'm suggesting that Christianity and the socio-economic entanglements are to be perceived as part of Christian life worlds of Ratsup. They're not distinct and separate entities, but they should be considered as part of the Christian life worlds. In other words, the matters concerning beliefs, practices, and spirituality are not separate realms from the realm of money, economy, jobs, and so on. So I suggest that for Rongmei Baptist, these aspects belong together and they are interwoven together into the fabric of life worlds. And of course, life worlds, when I talk about life worlds, I'm also talking about the violence of the encounters between life worlds. A big theme of my PhD research has to do with the study of the encounters between the notions, the life worlds of land and the life worlds of Christianity. In terms of methodology, the methodologies employed in my research is in part ethnographic, qualitative research that includes interviews, digital ethnography, and qualitative analysis of online content. It focuses on the town of Tamenglong in Manipur, in India, in northeast part of India. And initially, I was scheduled to go to India in person and to do field work, but because of COVID, I've had to change a lot of my methodologies to do remote digital methodology, which has meant that my method has lacked the in-person, the embodied, sensory kind of observations, participant observation. But I've found, to my surprise, that digital methods have also allowed me to develop a sustained and intimate access to the field. Sustained in the sense that I'm not limited to the space and time. I can always be in touch with my interlocutors quite extensively. And through WhatsApp conversations, I can follow up and I can have the conversation going on. The ethnographic method is coupled with what has been called autoethnography and theoretical engagement with mainly anthropology of Christianity and my own theological analysis. It might be worth noting that my previous training has been as a theologian. Let me give a bit of context to the group and the place that I'm focusing in my research and in this paper. I'm looking at the Rongmei Naga Baptists and they are part of the bigger ethnonym, part of the bigger community called, who are known by the ethnonym Nagas, and the Naga people. And the Rongmei Nagas are to be found in the state of Manipur. You may see in the map, the state is marked in blue here. And within Manipur, I'm looking at the town called Tamenglong, which is one of the the main cities of the Rongmei Nagas. And my focus is on Baptists because theologically they have specific distinctives that make this particular question and this particular issue interesting. To be sure, the study of Catholics and other denominations would be also fruitful, but my research is limited to the Baptist. It's also worth noting that the Rongmei Nagas also belong under the so-called scheduled or scheduled tribes of India. The scheduled tribes status is is enacted by the Indian Constitution in 1950s, and it is it's a status that's ascribed to people who, and I quote, who are suffering from extreme social, educational, and economic backwardness arising from their primitive agricultural practices, lack of infrastructure facilities, and geographical isolation. The Scheduled Tribes of India, or the ST, comprise about 700 ethnic groups in all over India, and they are usually referred to as the people who are living in underdeveloped places in India. And I think, just very briefly, it's worth noting that Manipur, the whole region in northeast India that is colored here in the map of India, the whole region of northeast India, and especially the states of Manipur, have been known or notorious to have infrastructural disparities that are developmentally backward. And I've noted a few of these literature that discusses the realities of what has been called developmental disparities. And I think that piece of information is important in order to understand the thrust of my argument here. My point in giving context to this is to show that the Rongmei people historically have been a people who experience impoverishment and the experience of developmental disparities. And it is in the context of that experience that the aspirations for development, the aspirations for progress and advancement emerges. So let's explore how Christianity, or Ratsap, the Christian life worlds, affect the socio-economic visions of Rongmei Baptists. Christian life worlds, or Ratsap. And I want to discuss this in terms of these three themes. From my interviews of interlocutors of Rongmei Baptist, it becomes very clear that Jesu Christa, which is the vernacular name for Jesus Christ, Jesu Christa is understood as a reformer, among many other things. One of my chapters in my thesis is entitled "The Multiple Lives of Jesu Christa." One of them happens to be as a reformer. In other words, when people received or quote unquote believe in Jesus, they embrace the vision of the reform and socio-economic reform that are preached together with the message of Christianity. So Jesu Christa is understood as a reformer, and part of that conversion process is the adoption of what I'm calling socio-economic praxis of Ratsap. Socio-economic praxis, I refer to these as some of the practices that were advocated within Christianity that were not quite religious or spiritual practices, but could be more accurately understood as socio-economic practices. For example, wearing Western-style clothes, or carrying a certain way hairstyle, right? These were certain ways in which people showed their allegiance to Jesu Christa by adopting a certain way of life, a certain way of socio-economic life, some of which included what they considered as hygiene, education, going to school, and so on. Naga theologian Panganungba, he writes that the moral attitudes and the economic vision of the missionaries, the Western missionaries, were passed on to converts. And these attitudes were reflected in the 19th century pietistic missionary theology that conflated Christian religion with morality, with Western culture and civilization. End quote. So, put differently, Jesu Christa is proclaimed, is perceived, and is practiced as one bringing reform, socio-economic reforms. And Jesu Christa is perceived as the figurehead personifying these movements towards development, towards transnational transcendence, to use the term of Sordas, and ultimately towards heaven. And so when Rongmei converts accepted or embraced Jesu Christa, they also embraced the socio-economic visions that the missionaries preached to them, and that were sustained largely by colonial views of the backwardness and the barbaric nature of indigenous cultures and so on. So I want to emphasize here that it is in the context of crisis, the experience of crisis in which the traditional practices were increasingly found to be ineffective in managing or for the communities to face the challenges of modernity. It was in the context of significant shifts, and I explore this in greater detail in my paper as well, in which Tamenglong town itself became from a village to an administrative center where offices, government offices, colonial offices were set up in the town of Tamenglong, and it completely introduced a completely different way of life. And in this experience of crisis and loss of, in a sense, being unhinged from their traditional way of life, it is in this experience of crisis that the vision, socio-economic vision of Christianity and Ratsap came, and it was accepted by the Rongmei converts. I think this picture depicts the kind of transition that's happening in around the time that I'm talking about. This is supposed to be in 1971 in one of the Naga villages. As you can see, the children in uniform and carrying a book, and they're surrounded by a curious group of children who are dressed in their traditional, in their more indigenous attires. And this vision, this kinds of comparison, or this kinds of display or imageries were profoundly influential in moving Rongmei converts to adopt Christianity. So I want to quickly explore the theological aspect of this discussion, and I want to suggest very briefly that it has to do with disruption and coloniality that was entangled in the Christian teaching. First of all, as I said, the socio-economic reforms, and as you might guess from this picture here, socio-economic reforms usually, almost always, entailed converts to move away from the tradition, to go to a particular way of dressing, the particular way of living, particular way of talking and socializing, right? And so the socio-economic reforms created disruption in the traditional ways of life, and part of that has to do with the discontinuities in traditional practices. Some of my interlocutors informed me that when Rongmeis became Christians, a lot of them were kicked out from their villages. First of all, that's a spatial relocation, spatial discontinuities that happened in their lives. And when they moved to these new villages, they completely abandoned their traditions, and they would only sing Christian songs. They would only pray in Christian ways, compared to the indigenous and landed practices of their traditional lives. This was a completely new way of living, and so it brought about a markedly discontinuous and markedly distinct disruption in their traditional practices. And the big part, in my opinion, of this disruption has to do with the vision of heaven and of rapture. From being located in the land and envisioning their lives in the land, now Christians can look to heaven and envision and anticipate a life of heaven. In other words, heaven, in other words, means complete relocation away from land. It is the ultimate disruption from the land and from tradition. And so the eschatological vision of heaven and rapture added to the sense of disruption, the sense of discontinuity in Christianity. Perhaps this picture, when put together like this, might give a helpful way of visualizing this. The picture on the left might be said to convey the cosmological view of Naga, the Naga people. This is a shawl in which all animals are lined up together, pretty much not in hierarchies, but they occupy the same plane, so to say. There's mythology that's repeated in a lot of the Naga tribes, in which humans, tigers, and spirits were brothers at one point. And that speaks to the cosmological equality, the notion that they occupy the same plane. Whereas on the right side, which is a painting of the Rapture, we see there's a clear hierarchy, and also there's disembodied faithful people who are being taken up into the sky. And also note the paintings of the land. There's clear roads, there are trains, there are buildings, there's development, there's quote-unquote civilization. And so the vision of the world, the vision of the cosmologies changed quite significantly. So with Christianity, Christian converts began to reimagine their cosmologies, from traditional and indigenous cosmologies to what I would consider as a more anthropocentric cosmology, in which human beings have a more human beings have ascendancy, purely, in my opinion, theologically, because they can appeal to Jesus Christ, the name of Jesus Christ. But that's a whole new discussion on theology. And there's also transformation of space and transformation of agencies. Prior to Christianity, in traditional life worlds, tigers have agency, trees have agency, rocks have agency, but that agency is completely upset in Christianity. Now it's only human beings who have agency. It is only God through Jesus Christ who has agencies. And so there's a transformation of agencies and transformation of space. Additionally, I argue in my paper that there's also a heritageization of Western societies. The missionaries were from the Western societies, and they brought Christianity to us. Look at them; they are progressed, they are advanced, and that's because they came to know about Christianity earlier than us. And so Christianity, Western societies are the way to go for us. And so there's the implicit coloniality in that. In my paper, I quoted a song, "Colorado might not be heaven, but it must be on the way," and I think that captures the sensibilities in which Western societies are perceived as having gone ahead, and Rongmei societies being on the way to catch up to them. Speaking of transformation of space, I thought that this might be interesting for some of you. And I mentioned this in the paper. This Barak waterfall is the waterfall that I was talking about in my paper, in which prior to Christianity, these places were rich, were livid with stories, with quote-unquote spirits, with mythologies, right? And these are places that are occupied in the sense that you don't just go into them as blank slate. They are occupied by spirits or by pythons, and you don't just go and have fun there. And those are risky places to be, because they are already occupied by persons and non-humans. With Christianity, all these places become empty lands, and you might notice that the caption here, Duigai Nam Fellowship Picnic, is Duigai Nam is a church, is a village, and this is a group from a village church that went to Barak Waterfall and took pictures. It's just like any other place, any other tourist spots. Of course, you see the picture of people swimming here, and so on. So sacred geographies are transformed into sites for pleasure, for leisure, for tourism, and so on. This bird here is the famed, famed in the context of Rongmei communities, the Ahoipino or Amur falcon raptors. Uh, in traditional narratives, these birds were called guests because they played a very important role in balancing uh, um, the ecosystem by consuming insects and pests and all of that. But with modernization, and when the agency of this raptor bird is kind of eradicated, they these birds are now seen as commodities for hunting or for making money. So just a glimpse of the transformation to the space and agencies that I'm talking about in this paper. Of course, the in recent years there has been move to modernize or to develop the areas, and this is just a few days back. The train has reached the hills, and although there's excitement about the prospect of trains coming to these hills, there's also nervousness, and this nervousness was materialized in earlier this month when there's a huge landslide. You can see the whole hill has been shaved off here, and the landslide killed over 50 people in this place, and you can see that the village has been completely mowed down. And there has been increasing awareness that this is due to the irresponsible implementation of policies, that development is not taking into account the texture of the land, the nature of the land, the geographies, the liabilities. In other words, they are not developmental policies are not aware of the situations, and of course, this paragraph here puts it very concisely, saying that instead of listening to the land, instead of paying attention to the land, these policies are pretty much copy pasted into the context, and this has caused all of these tragedies that could have been avoided in the first place. And I think this talks about this is of course about developmental policies, but the corollary of Christian theologies or religious beliefs is pretty much the same. When socio-economic visions that are not necessarily relevant to the land are copy pasted into this context, it can cause only violence. And as I've shown, the violence of its encounters of life worlds is a part of the history of Christianity among the Rongmeis. So quickly, what is my concluding thoughts? Firstly, I'm proposing that mobility of religious ideas, mobility of economic visions should be marked by reciprocity and not coloniality. And in the context of Rongmei Christianity, first of all, that would mean to decolonize Christian life worlds or decolonize Ratsap. Firstly, recognize the colonial entanglements and make sense of that first, and then the community needs to come together to make sure that the elements that need to be decolonized are done so. And secondly, to recognize the theological agencies of Rongmei communities. By that I mean there are rich theological motifs and imageries in the indigenous practices that are meaningful. For example, the motif of festivals, the motifs of celebration, as I mentioned in my paper, that could be picked up as the vision of progress rather than buildings and roads and, as I mentioned, the colonized visions of heaven, which is paved roads and city-like built houses and all of this stuff. Instead of those colonial visions of heaven and progress, I suggest that the agencies of Rongmei communities in articulating the visions of progress, visions of reconciliation, visions of harmony could be more effective in articulating the theological visions of the Rongmei people. So that's my presentation. I'm aware that I'm not able to cover a lot of the details in the paper because this is only a 30 minutes presentation, but I look forward to engaging with you. Thank you.